immediately I took the sensor and I started kind of holding it in different locations of the cockpit and quickly realized that the average carbon monoxide readings were hovering between 30 and 80 parts per million, depending on how close I held it, down to my shin and up to my face level. And right then I told my passengers, hey, I think we're going to stop this flight pretty quickly. I think we're going to be turning around. And I remember thinking, do I turn around or do I keep going forward and maybe land at another airport a little closer to our destination? And thought about it for all of about 15 seconds and decided, you know what, this is a decision that it's not even a decision. I should just go back to the closest airport and we'll figure it out from there.
That's one of the two pilots we talked to this week who encountered carbon monoxide in the cockpit just days ago, and they'll tell us how they discovered the CO, what they did about it, and what caused it. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with news and safety tips for pilots and student pilots. I'm Max Truscott. If you are listening to us for the first time, please touch the subscribe button so that new shows will download each week for free onto your smartphone. And if you have thought about someday maybe buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision jet, or you'd like some flight training in one, please call me today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Last week in episode 101, we heard from a student pilot and an air traffic controller about how they dealt with an emergency in which oil completely covered her windshield. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. Plus, this week in the news, Boeing buys ForeFlight, and we'll tell you what that means for GA pilots. Severe weather has destroyed airplanes in 2 states in the South over the past week, and we'll tell you what was unusual about a perpetrator who was just arrested for stealing an aircraft. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Flying Magazine, ForeFlight opened business for 2007 around a single mission, creating software that makes flight planning easier. And last week, the Boeing company announced it had formally acquired the Houston-based ForeFlight. Well, I think everyone here knows that ForeFlight is the most popular electronic flight bag app here in the U.S., and their roots are in general aviation. Now, Boeing purchased Jeppesen back in 2000, and for the past 2 years, ForeFlight users have had a choice of either using the government charts, also sometimes called NOS charts, or the more expensive charts from Jeppesen. And a fear I've seen expressed online by some ForeFlight users is that maybe in the future they might be forced to use the more expensive Jeppesen charts since Boeing now owns Jeppesen and ForeFlight. Well, I did find this quote online. It comes from ForeFlight Executive Vice President Stephen Newman. He says, quote, "I can tell you on the record that NOS charts and ForeFlight will not go away. I can also allay concerns of GA pilots that there will be no changes in price, and our commitment to providing GA pilots the best and most innovative products is as strong as ever. It's our passion and our mission that will never change." And I did exchange email earlier in the week with CEO and co-founder Tyson Weiss. He was asked on AOPA Live whether prices would increase. He said, absolutely not. And he said that they're working currently on 11.1 releases that will come out shortly. He says they have a lot of features in it for everyone at every price point. And he did make an analogy with Apple, saying that they offer iPhones at multiple price points and that ForeFlight will continue to do the same for its users. From avweb.com, 40 aircraft destroyed by a tornado. The tornadoes that ripped through the southeast last week wreaked havoc in Lee County, Alabama, killing 23 people and cutting a path of destruction at the Eufaula Airport. At Whedon Field, approximately 35 miles south of Columbus, Georgia, approximately 40 aircraft and virtually all of its buildings, including 25 hangars, were destroyed. Aerial footage reveals the intensity of the tornado, with airplane parts strewn over a wide area, and a hangar collapsed on top of a Honda jet. CNN is reporting that one of the tornadoes that touched down in Lee County to the north had been upgraded to an EF4 intensity, suggesting winds up to 170 miles an hour. The one tornado was said to have a ground track that was nearly a mile wide. And on Wednesday this week, I had a text message from Patreon supporter Troy Wistman, who told me of morning storms that reached 95 miles an hour at the Grand Prairie Municipal Airport, located 12 miles south of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Now, he sent over photos, and from those pictures, it appears that about a half dozen airplanes, mostly Cessna 172s, were piled up on each other on the ramp, and there was one airplane that was completely upside down on its back. From Politico.com, former Delta executive expected to get the FAA administration position. The president is expected to nominate former airline executive Steve Dickinson to be FAA administrator, apparently abandoning a months-long quest to have his personal pilot to head the agency. The nomination, which several sources said could be announced as soon as this week, but have been rumored for months, comes 14 months after Michael Huerta left the post. In the meantime, Dan Elwell has been acting head of the FAA. Dixon retired as Delta Airlines Senior Vice President of Flight Operations last fall. He spent a total of 27 years at the airline and previously was an Air Force officer and fighter pilot. Dixon has represented Delta on a panel that advises the FAA about NextGen, which is the agency's plan for revamping air traffic control. And in light sport news, this comes from greencarcongress.com. By Aerospace's Sunflyer 2 completes its first flight with a Siemens electric propulsion motor. The Sunflyer 2 successfully completed its first official flight with the Siemens motor at Centennial Airport south of Denver, Colorado. The Sunflyer family of aircraft includes the 2-seat Sunflyer 2 and the 4-seat Sunflyer 4, and they aim to be the first FAA-certified practical all-electric airplanes to serve the flight training and GA markets. Siemens will provide electric propulsion systems for the Sunflyer 2, a 57-pound SP7DD motor with a 90-kilowatt peak rating, which would be about 120 horsepower, and a continuous power setting of up to 70 kilowatts or 94 horsepower. Sunflyer brings the full promise of electric propulsion to the market with safe, practical, and reliable electric aircraft. The all-electric operation requires no aviation fuel and results in zero emissions and significantly lower noise pollution compared to conventional aircraft. The sleek Sunflyer design also features enhanced speed and altitude performance with extremely low operating cost. Sunflyer's program application to the FAA was accepted under FAR Part 23 in the spring of 2018. They say the Sunflyer 2 prototype will conduct extensive additional flight tests in 2019 and continue to work closely with the FAA on certification. And from digitaltrends.com, JPA is now accepting pre-orders for its jet-powered flying motorcycle. Yes, I did read that correctly. They say, jetpack's not enough for you? Are you looking for something more adventurous? Well, then check out the Speeder, a new jet-powered motorcycle from Jetpack Aviation, or JPA. The sci-fi-inspired vehicle is no comic book dream. It's designed and built by the same company that created the JB-10 Jetpack and recently launched the world's first Jetpack Racing League. JPA is currently taking pre-orders on the self-stabilizing jet-powered bike. The flying bike uses 4 turbojet engines that can be powered by kerosene or Jet A fuel. The 4 engines produce a combined maximum thrust of 705 pound-force, which is enough to lift the 230-pound motorcycle and the weight of an operator up to 250 pounds. According to the vehicle specs, the airborne motorcycle can climb to 15,000 feet and fly at speeds of up to 150 miles an hour. Each flight can last up to 22 minutes, and I must say, it probably won't be at 15,000 feet for very long if it can only last 22 minutes. The Speeder uses a tilt-to-accelerate flight system with hand controls. It also uses a fly-by-wire control system that self-stabilizes the vehicle in the air, much like a drone. JPA plans to build different versions of the Speeder so it can be flown on a recreational pilot certificate or sport pilot's license for convenience. They're also working on an ultralight version. Each jet-powered motorcycle can be yours for the low price of $380,000, and that includes a flight suit and a helmet. And also in light sport news from avweb.com, Sling launches an LSA-based airline training program. The Sling Pilot Academy is set to induct its first round of students to an accelerated airline pilot program based at the Torrance Airport in Southern California. The school has also announced a $20,000 scholarship to be offered to one student who applies before August 5th. They plan to use the SLSA Sling 2 as the initial training platform, and they promise to take students from a private ticket through MEI, the multi-engine instructor rating, in 6 months for $45,595, or from 0 time in 9 months and $62,595. The Rotex 912 powered side-by-side Sling 2, which is going to be used, is fitted with a dual-screen Garmin 3X Touch, a GTN of 650 GPS, and a GFC 500 autopilot. Now, I was not real familiar with Sling, so I went and did a little bit of research, and it turns out there was just an article recently in generalaviationnews.com in which one of their authors flew the latest version, which is the Sling TSI, and it's made by the Airplane Factory, which is a company based in South Africa. Now, they've got several different models. They've got the Sling 2, the Sling 4, and then the Sling TSI. Now, that newest version is approximately $55,000, though you can start with sub-assemblies and pay as you go. So it's a build-it-yourself. To that, you would add the new Rotex 915 engine and a panel of digital instruments, which will add another $82,000, and company officials say the final price would be about $135,000 after you've completed the aircraft. Performance-wise, they claim a range of 800 nautical miles and 155 knots true airspeed on an 8-gallon per hour consumption. And I'll include a link to that article in our show notes. And from flyer.co.uk, that's the Flyer magazine, a British adventurer plans to circumnavigate the world by gyrocopter. James Ketchell, a UK scouting ambassador, is already the world's first and only person to row the Atlantic Ocean, climb Mount Everest, and cycle 18,000 miles around the world. Ketchell, 37, will stop at schools around the world to give motivational talks and raise funds for 2 children's charities. He said, "I want to help children understand, however difficult it might get, that there is always hope and a route to achieving your goals." He said, "As a teenager, I struggled with depression and had zero confidence in myself." In 2007, James was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident that left him with broken legs as well as a broken and dislocated ankle. He was told his physically active lifestyle could be over, but he refused to give up. In 2014, he became the first person to row across the Atlantic Ocean. He successfully climbed to the top of Mount Everest, and he cycled 18,000 miles around the world, the so-called ultimate triathlon. He said, "My plan is to visit a school in every country I fly across, sharing stories of fun and adventure." He starts his world record attempt on March 31st from Popham Airfield in Hampshire. He aims to be the first person to circumnavigate the globe in his Magni M16C open cockpit tandem gyrocopter, even though he has less than 300 hours as pilot in command. The gyrocopter travels at just 70 knots with a range of about 700 nautical miles. He said the biggest challenge will be the unpredictable weather, as the gyrocopter is open to the elements. And you can track his flight on his website, and there is a link in our show notes. From the BBC.com, the Shoreham Air Show crash pilot has been acquitted. This is a story we talked about in episode 100. The pilot of a jet that crashed at the Shoreham Air Show, killing 11 men, has been found not guilty of manslaughter by gross negligence. And as we mentioned in episode 100, this trial has been going on for several months. Andrew Hill's ex-military jet exploded in a fireball on the A27 motorway in Sussex in August of 2015. He miraculously escaped when the aircraft broke up and he was thrown into a ditch. He suffered head injuries and fractures to his ribs and spine and was placed in an induced coma before being discharged a month later. Prosecutors acknowledged that Mr. Hill was an experienced pilot, but said he had been known to take risk, and the jet was probably as much as 1,000 feet below the height required at the top of the loop. The former RAF pilot, who was 54, denied deliberately beginning a loop maneuver despite flying too low and too slowly. The defense argued that Mr. Hill had been suffering from cognitive impairment at the time the jet crashed. On the steps of the courthouse, Mr. Hill read out the names of all 11 victims and said, "A number of people were injured. I'm truly sorry for that part that I played in their deaths, and it's they I will remember for the rest of my life." From aviationpros.com, Daher unveils the new TBM 940. That's the latest version of its single-engine, very fast turboprop aircraft, and it sets new standards with the integration of an automated throttle, an automatic de-icing system, along with enhancements to style and ergonomic elements inside the cabin. One key TBM 940 feature is its automated throttle. They claim is the first ever installed on a standard production turboprop aircraft weighing less than 12,500 pounds. It's fully integrated with the autopilot, and they say this single power lever auto throttle automatically adjusts the aircraft speeds based on the preset flight profile from climb out to the landing approach. In addition to reducing pilot workload, the auto throttle enables the TBM 940 to be operated to the edge of approved power regimes for its Pratt & Whitney PT6-66D turboprop engine, providing optimum performance and efficiency from the power plant. Also introduced on the TBM 940 is increased automation for the de-icing system. When icing or ice accretion is detected, and if the pilot does not take action, the system is automatically activated for de-icing of the airframe, windshield, propeller, and the engine's particle separator. TBM 940 retains the same range and handling qualities that made Daher's TBM 900 series a true success, with more than 267 aircraft in the product line delivered. And finally, from stgeorgeutah.com, a woman is back in jail in connection with an alleged aircraft theft. A Utah woman was arrested this week after she failed to appear for court hearings on charges that she allegedly took an aircraft from a hangar in November 2017 and abandoned it off the runway when it became damaged. The arrest of Mary Sue Phillips, 41, is the latest step in a winding journey toward justice. It began when a detective was dispatched to the Beryl Junction Airport in November 2017 on a reported theft of an aircraft and criminal mischief. The plane's owner told detectives that he had flown the day before and parked the plane in the hangar before he left for the day. When he arrived that following day, he found the plane sitting off the runway near a metal I-beam far from the hangar. The aircraft's doors and windows were open, its propeller damaged, and the emergency beacon triggered. Meanwhile, detectives received information that the defendant, going by the name of Susie Dodd, was allegedly overheard talking about flying a plane in the Beryl Valley. Detectives learned Phillip was seen driving a Ford Focus with tires that matched impressions left at the scene. A second witness told detectives that Phillips, quote, started bragging about flying a plane in Beryl, but when the witness asked Phillips if she had a pilot's license, the male she was traveling with became visibly upset and abruptly ended the conversation. She then failed to appear for 2 court appearances, and a $10,000 cash-only bail warrant was granted for her arrest. And what's unusual about that? I have heard of many aircraft being stolen before, but never by a woman. Coming up next, my updates, and then we'll talk with 2 pilots who've had carbon monoxide issues in their aircraft, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. You may have wondered why in the news I didn't talk about a Cirrus pilot who pulled his cap's parachute in a plane over the Caribbean last week, and that's because we're going to have that pilot on the show here in just a couple of days. I've just completed that interview with Ed Regensburg, who is now off on vacation, and that's going to be episode 103, and he will talk in detail about what led up to that incident and what he did and why his airplane is now on the bottom of the ocean. So check that out in just a couple of days. And I'm sure many of you have seen a rather interesting crash video that occurred in Canada a few days ago, which was a Cirrus SR20 that was coming into land, and it passed right in front of a car with dash cam video, and it was very, very, very close. Now, that aircraft apparently had an engine failure, was trying to make it to the runway and just barely skimmed the highway, knocking a light pole over in the process. The airplane then crashed. Both the flight instructor and students survived, though, with injuries, and we certainly wish them well. I'll put a link to that video in the show notes, so if you haven't seen it, you can click on it there. And also, way back in episode 79, when I was at the AOPA regional event in Carbondale, we talked with Ray Hobbs. Ray is the founder of Skysight.com. He makes some rather interesting sunglasses, and we had talked with him for about 3 minutes, and he sent me a pair of these for free to try out, and I've had them here for quite some time, and I finally got around to trying them the last 3 or 4 flights that I've made, and you know what? I was kind of impressed, so I'll just tell you briefly what they are. Essentially, it's sunglasses, but the tinting has been removed in the lower portion of the sunglasses, right about where the glare shield would fall in an aircraft. So I've flown with these in both SR20 and today in the Cirrus Vision Jet. And it's pretty remarkable. It allows you to see the instruments far more clearly because there's no tint over them, while still having a tint, for the outside view that you have. And then there's a third little segment down at the very bottom, which is a bifocal area. So, for example, I use a 1.5 diopter, reading glass, and he built that into the lens, and it's really pretty remarkable. I don't use that part much at all, but I did notice a couple times when I glanced down, it was kind of handy to actually be able to read, things close up. So pretty cool little thing. Check it out. See what you think about it. That's at skysight.com. And as I said, he's not an advertiser here, but he did provide me a free set of glasses, and it's just kind of been fun to check it out. There's also a video I ran across a few days ago, which I thought you might be interested in. I get emails from time to time from people asking me to talk a little bit more about light sport, and I just ran across a fascinating video by AvWeb's Paul Bertorelli, in which he talks about the accident rate for light sport aircraft. And according to his analysis, that rate is 5 times higher for general aviation aircraft as a whole. And he cites a couple different possibilities, one of which is the lighter wing loading of these aircraft. And so they get tossed around in the wind a little bit more frequently. And he said that for landing accidents, people tend to, as a result, over control. but I was surprised. 5 times higher, that's really amazing. So instead of, a fatal accident rate of roughly 1 fatality per 100,000 hours flown, they're up around 5 or 6 times that. So you may want to check that out, and I'll put a link to that here in our show notes. And also, I saw a posting on Facebook from David St. George. David is one of the National CFI of the Years. He's out in the Ithaca, New York area, and he published something about a helicopter safety initiative, which he said works just as well for fixed-wing aircraft. It's called Land and Live, and this particular video is a recreation of a helicopter accident, but they provide 2 different endings, one in which the crew actually survives. And I went online to the rotor.org website, and I found under the Helicopter Association International's page on initiatives, their Land and Live initiative, and it says, prevent accidents, take the pledge. Precautionary landing is one tool in every pilot's toolbox that can prevent almost every accident chain. Is your flight not going well? Do you have a warning light? Are your passengers not feeling well, or is the weather turning? As the pilot in command, only you can decide if you should continue the flight. Will you make the promise to always land when safety is at stake? And I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes where you can see that helicopter video, and also a link to the Land and Live page at the Helicopter Association International website. Also, I got an interesting email from Edward, and Edward's one of our Patreon supporters. He said that in 2 recent interviews that we had of 2 different pilots, one who had an electrical failure in IFR, and the other who was last week, the windshield covered in oil. He said, truly great stories. I'm happy that the outcomes allowed for both pilots to survive. He said, one thing that struck me, though, was the emotional toll that these events took on both pilots, most notably when they became convinced that they might not survive the emergency before the outcome was ever known. He says, again, I understand the fear that comes into our mind when our lives are endangered. I have survived more than my fair share of dangerous events in my police career. At the same time, I think that it is important for pilots to understand that being mentally prepared to handle an emergency is just as important as aviate, navigate, communicate. In law enforcement, we call it the will to survive or the will to win. Quite simply, it means that no matter how badly you are hurt, no matter how grave the threat, no matter how insurmountable the odds, you do not give up. The will to survive is something that has to live deep in the soul of every pilot. Closely related to priority 1 of flying the airplane is keeping your head in check. In aviation, we do a good job of teaching the systematic steps of running through an emergency procedure, but spend virtually no time understanding or preparing how to function and think through highly stressful events. He said, bottom line, be mentally ready for the stress of an emergency. Do not allow yourself to contemplate your own demise. Keep working, keep flying, keep thinking of a solution. Don't give up and win. And so I really started to wonder after I read that, what kinds of training might be out there for people to, as he said, basically prepare ahead of time so that you can function and be able to think clearly as you're going through a highly stressful event. Now, I haven't researched it yet, and so I thought I'd reach out to listeners to see what kinds of training have you seen, perhaps in other industries, that might be applied to pilots that could help them mentally prepare ahead of time and basically train themselves to be able to think clearly through an emergency as opposed to getting stressed out and not being able to, effectively deal with the emergency. So if you have any ideas, please go ahead and go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top, and send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. And let me briefly mention our Patreon site. If you're enjoying this show and you find value in it, well, we can offer you a few extra goodies if you choose to support the show each month. For example, our $4 a month supporters get copies of the scripts for each of these new shows, and our $8 per month supporters get the scripts plus a list of links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news because of time constraints. So, for example, this week there were 18 stories that didn't make it into the news. We also have a number of super supporters who donate $20 a month or more. And I'd like to thank these new Patreon supporters who have joined us in the last couple of weeks. They include Daniel Sternberg, who's a new super supporter, Thomas Kalwasser, who added his pledge up to $8, Walt Weaver, Brad Barron, Tim Delaney, who's also a super supporter, Mike Bowler, Jimmy Reeks, Jonathan Fink, Arthur Gunn, also a new super supporter, Steve Schatz, a new super supporter, John Huthmaker, Chris Buller, who's also a super supporter, David West, Ken Trawick, and John Hocella. Thanks to these people and to everyone who supports the show in any way, including people who leave reviews and send us emails, send us listener questions and feedback as well. I really love having you as part of the show. Now stick around because we're going to talk to two pilots who had some real problems with carbon monoxide in just a moment, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm talking now with David West. David, you contacted me earlier in the week and you said, quote, "Your episode on carbon monoxide poisoning may have saved my life and those of my passengers this weekend." That's pretty amazing. Welcome to the show and tell me what happened.
Yeah, thank you. So after listening to your show a couple of months ago, it was the final impetus to get me to buy a carbon monoxide detector for my own use in general aviation aircraft. I ended up going with one of the Sensorcon models. And I've used it maybe a half dozen times across a variety of aircraft that I've rented. And this last weekend, myself and two passengers, one of whom is a general aviation pilot, private pilot certificate, we rented a retractable gear, a 1980 retract Cessna 182. And we flew a flight from Los Angeles out to Yuma, Arizona for the air show there this past weekend. And I used my sensor. I turned it on and basically had initially just planned on relying on, its noise and buzzing feature to get my attention. And I had it mounted to the sidewall of the aircraft, unfortunately out of my field of sight, which will come in kind of important later, because on the departure leg all the way to Yuma, I did not notice any problems, and I never thought to actually grab the sensor and look at it after the initial climb period. So we took off. During the climb, I looked at the sensor and the levels looked fine, and I didn't think anything more of it. Then on the return leg, once again, we started the aircraft on the ground, I checked the sensor, it looked fine. Took a quick look at it once we got above 1,000 feet AGL and started the kind of cruise climb portion. And again, the levels kind of hovered between 0 and 1 part per million, which is kind of what I expect to see in a sensor like that based on previous flights. And then about 10 minutes later, after configuring for cruise, I just thought, hey, why don't I go ahead and pull the sensor off the sidewall and just see what the reading is? And I looked at it and it was alarming. It obviously had already started alarming and it was up past 35 parts per million. And that got my attention pretty quickly. And so immediately I took the sensor and I started kind of holding it in different locations of the cockpit and quickly realized that the average carbon monoxide readings were hovering between 30 and 80 parts per million, depending on how close I held it, down to my shin and up to my face level. And right then I told my passengers, hey, I think we're going to stop this flight pretty quickly. I think we're going to be turning around. And I remember thinking, do I turn around or do I keep going forward and maybe land at another airport a little closer to our destination? And thought about it for all of about 15 seconds and decided, you know what, this is a decision that it's not even a decision. I should just go back to the closest airport and we'll figure it out from there. So I was on VFR flight following, called approach, told them we have a high carbon monoxide limit, like immediate handling, and we turned back to the airport. And it was basically a non-issue as far as getting back to the airport. The tower asked if we needed any special handling or any considerations, and I told them no. On the return, basically, we opened all the vents of the cockpit, all of the cabin vents, and especially once we went to a lower power setting in the engine and started that descent, the levels cleaned up a little bit and we got to around 20, 25 parts per million. We landed, called a mechanic on the field, and he came out and we pulled the cowl off the engine. And my best guess is that the leakage was mostly coming from the exhaust gas temperature probe. So the way it works is basically on the left exhaust pipe on the engine, there's kind of maybe a 1/8 inch diameter hole, and then there's kind of a C-band clamp that holds this probe up against that hole, and that clamp was loose, so you could physically wiggle it, and you could see the hole around the temperature probe. And we tightened that up, did a thorough, to the best of our ability, inspected the rest of the exhaust portion. The mechanic also pulled the cabin heater shroud off of that portion of the exhaust system, but we found no cracks or no obvious issues. During the flight, we had not been using cabin heat, which is an important point to make. And we didn't fiddle with it at all as soon as I saw that alarm, just in case that was the cause and it would have made it worse. And by that time, it was already, the sun was setting and I really didn't want to mess with a test flight at night. And so we got a hotel and we called it a night. The next morning, we did a flight, and again, carbon monoxide level was basically showing 0 on the ground, 0 in takeoff. And then once we got to cruise, the level did start to climb a little bit again. It never got anywhere close to as high as that 80 parts per million from the day before. And after basically adjusting, kind of running through a quick test regime of different power settings and cowl flap settings and such, we were able to get the parts per million in the cockpit to settle at around 8 to 10 parts per million. And at that point, we elected to continue the flight and get it back to the home base. But that was a real eye-opening experience, because it's something that, had we not had that detector and had we continued on for this 2+ hour flight at, up to 80 parts per million, who knows how that flight would have ended.
Now, you said something rather interesting, which was that it was kind of out of sight, out of view, and had already started to sense high levels, but you weren't aware of that initially. Now, does that device have an audio type alert, or do you have to have it in view and look at it?
Yeah, so the specific unit, the Sensorcon that we used is, and it's an industrial device. It's not specifically made for aviation, but after doing a bunch of kind of background reading and such, I chose that unit because it seemed to be of a higher quality, higher fidelity measurement. But unfortunately, in this case, it was not loud enough. It does have a beeping alarm, but it was not loud enough to hear in the cockpit, especially perhaps maybe particularly because I was using an active noise canceling headset. Maybe the frequency of the alarm was attenuated more. The device also has flashing lights and a buzz function, like a buzzing function. So had it been clipped to my shirt, maybe I would have felt that. In any case, I strongly recommend anyone using a portable sensor to, tape it or Velcro it within their field of vision on the panel, because had it been directly in my field of vision, I would have seen the flashing red lights. It would have been much more obvious. So that's a strong recommendation that I would make for any pilots using such a monitor.
So let's see, you said it was on the sidewall. I'm trying to vision sitting in a 172. So that would put it down somewhere between your hip and your knee, and maybe, all of 3, no more than 4 feet away from your ear?
Yeah, that's correct. So basically, right, real close, pretty much the middle of my thigh, the left side of my thigh. And like I said, there's a chance that in the entire departure leg from Los Angeles to Yuma, it may have been going off and I just didn't notice it because I only thought to check it during the initial climb. It hadn't occurred to me that maybe the carbon monoxide levels would differ in different phases of flight. But I found very much so that is an important fact, is that you should be testing it in multiple phases of flights. Climb and descent, the levels were between, either 0 with no reading or 1 part per million. But then as soon as we got to cruise and, had a higher airspeed and with the cowl flaps closed, I'm assuming that carbon monoxide built up in the engine compartment and then kind of seeped back into the cabin, which is not something that happened during climb or descent.
Now, how long have you had your CO detector, and how many flights have you used it on, and what kind of readings have you observed on other flights?
Yeah, I bought it in December of this last year, so that would have been about 3 months ago. I think I've used it on, let's say, maybe 5 or 6 flights, and with a variety of aircraft, a different 182, a 172, and then this retractable gear 182. And the levels are usually, in fact, quite frequently, they'll read 0 parts per million during flight. And sometimes when sitting on the ground idling, it might read 1 or 2 parts per million. And I think that's just because the exhaust gas is usually routed right underneath the cabin. And so if you're sitting there and the engine's idling, it'll kind of, flow up around the cockpit and into the cockpit. But this is by far the highest levels I had seen. And as an interesting point of comparison, as soon as I bought the carbon monoxide detector, I stuck it in the tailpipe of my car when it was idling, and it read 10 parts per million. So that's an interesting comparison. It's literally in the tailpipe of a vehicle, 10, and inside the cabin, we spiked up to 80 parts per million on that flight on Saturday.
Wow, I'm surprised. I would have thought the output from the exhaust would be much higher than that, but I guess car emissions these days have gotten cleaned up considerably.
Exactly. Modern automobiles, I guess, have a decent mixture ratio and emission controls, and it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, interesting. Now, had you flown the 182 RG previously with the detector?
I had flown it in January, so about a month and a half, 2 months ago. I don't recall at this moment, though, whether I checked the detector in cruise or not. And that was a shorter flight. It was less than an hour.
So you've made a really important discovery, which is that just carrying the detector alone isn't sufficient. You need to have it in view.
Yes, in view, and check it during multiple phases of flight, especially cruise.
Wow. So any other thoughts about this you'd like to share with our listeners?
I can't recommend, more strongly that every pilot get a carbon monoxide detector. I really, really think that all CFIs should really emphasize this. It's the cost of, flying an airplane for about an hour, call it $150 or so, but it really can be the difference between a successful flight or someone not being here to be able to give you this story.
Yeah, I think that's really a good summation. Essentially, you're trading 1 hour of duel for many, many years of safety.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, David, thanks so much for sharing your story today, and I hope you continue to have 0 ppm readings in the future.
Thank you.
Now, after our interview, David followed up with an email, and he wrote just a couple of other points. He said, one of my passengers, after the fact, mentioned that he had smelled exhaust fumes during the first flight, which was the departure leg from LA to Yuma. That's the flight that I only checked the detector on the climb out, but never during cruise. I had slightly congested sinuses, and so I did not smell anything and was unaware of it. I'll be sure to make it clear to my passengers from now on that this is not normal. And then he also says that same passenger also turned out to have a strong headache during the day at the air show, but had not mentioned it. I too had a light headache, but had assumed it was related to my congested sinuses. It is possible that they were both carbon monoxide related from the first leg. Well, David, thanks so much for sharing your story and for the follow-up information. Now here's a second incident that occurred literally within a day or two of David's incident. And earlier today, I had a message from one of our Patreon supporters, Sid Sada, who told me that a good friend of his, David Kerr, had just been involved in an incident involving CO, and I've got Dave on the line here. Dave, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, tell us a little bit about what happened.
A friend of mine has a Cessna 180 Skywagon, and on Monday of this week, he invited me to ride along on a trip from Raleigh, North Carolina, up to State College, Pennsylvania. We were taking a third pilot up there to pick up another aircraft. And Brad's proud of his relatively new 1954 Skywagon, so he invited me along. I was riding in the back seat because I had lost the coin toss, but I was promised a front seat on the way back. Everything went pretty well, leaving our home airport here. The only thing of interest was that as we were starting the engine, we had preheated it because it was a cool day, but we got a pretty big backfire when we were starting it. And we didn't think too much of that at the time, but it probably figured into the story a little bit later on. The route from Raleigh up to State College crosses a good chunk of the Appalachian Mountains. So we stayed away from them as long as we could, but then started to cross at Front Royal, Virginia. And when we did that, we had to climb from 5,500 to 7,500 feet. That made it pretty cool in the cabin, and the pilot turned the heat on. And almost within 10 seconds, the portable carbon dioxide detector that I wear clipped to my jacket suddenly started alarming. And that alarms by first shaking, and then making a noise, and then flashing a light. So it's pretty hard not to notice that. And when I looked at it, it was reading 35 parts per million, which is exactly the level it's supposed to alarm at. And as I was watching it, it kept climbing. And I told the pilot, and he started trying to figure out why that was happening. And it climbed up at one point to almost 75 parts per million. Meanwhile, the pilot, Brad, was trying different combinations of heat, cowl flap openings, and outside air vents to try to figure out what he had changed that caused the carbon dioxide level to go up and what would help to bring it down. And we eventually found that turning off the heat and opening the wing root vents and opening the cowl flaps would reduce the CO down to about into the teens, which is, the most we would want to fly with. And that worked okay. So we flew on up to our intended destination, University Park Airport in State College. And fortunately, there was a mechanic on duty there. we had him pull the cowl and look at the exhaust system. What he found was that the exhaust riser, the pipe coming out of the number one cylinder, had broken right at the collar that bolts onto the cylinder.
Wow. So that means there was exhaust coming directly out of the engine into the engine compartment and then finding its way back into the cabin?
Yeah, it had to find its way from the cylinder into the fresh air intake for the heating system. But, they're in the same general neighborhood. So it started coming in. We had no indication it was coming in except, the alarm of the CO detector. And a short while after that, we started smelling the exhaust gas, but the alarm went off first.
And did you happen to notice how high the level was when you started to smell it?
Well, it was sitting up there in the 70s.
Okay, so it was pretty high. So what did you decide to do? Did you get the airplane repaired there, or what happened?
Well, it's a 1954 airplane. They don't keep those parts on the shelf, as you might imagine. The mechanic called around. Initially, he thought he'd be able to get a part expressed in, and we would just have to stay overnight, get the part in, and fly back. Unfortunately, it's going to take probably a week to get those parts in. And as a result, we ended up just renting a car and driving back, which really disappointed us because we had this tremendous headwind on the way up, and we were really looking forward to that tailwind coming back. But we were glad to be safe and breathing fresh air.
Wow. Now, I imagine that's got to be, at least an 8-hour car ride?
Yep, almost exactly. Yeah. But we had a chance to stop and get some good barbecue, so.
That's great. Well, I've been to both State College and Raleigh, and I have driven Interstate 95, so I was kind of guessing that's about what it was. Well, tell me how it is you happen to have a CO detector with you. What motivated you to buy one?
Well, there's an ancient reason why I bought one, and there's a modern reason. The long ago reason is that back in 1982, my grandmother died from carbon monoxide when one of the chimneys in her house collapsed at night and the furnace fumes overcame her. So I've always been kind of sensitive to carbon monoxide issues, recognizing it as the killer that sneaks up on you. Now, the more modern motivation for buying the alarm, 3 things happened in this past December. One was that there was that Piper Dakota accident in Iowa, where a student pilot called in and said the flight instructor had a heart attack, but he thought he could land the plane with himself, the pilot, and the 2 passengers in it. But he didn't, and they crashed, and they all died. And the NTSB report said that there was elevated levels of carbon monoxide in all 4 inhabitants, and there was no post-crash fire, so that got in there beforehand. And then a few days later, Rick Durden published an article in AvWeb about carbon monoxide and the availability of these detectors. And then a few days after that, Sid played your podcast for me regarding the self-flying Mooney, where the pilot was overcome by carbon monoxide. The plane landed itself, and he survived to tell the story. So those 3 things together, plus the links both in Rick's article and in your podcast, got me to get online and order a detector that next day. And I've been carrying it around ever since. I haven't had much chance to use it myself, so I've been loaning it out to other pilots and getting their pilot reports on it. This flight on Monday was the first time I've actually used it in an airplane. So I was very impressed by how it worked and very glad I had it.
And what model do you have?
I have I guess it's pronounced Toxin 3 by a company called Otis, O-T-I-S. And it's a little clip-on. And as I said earlier, it alerts at 35 parts per million. And it flashes and it shakes and it screeches at you. And if it gets up to 100 parts per million, you can't even turn it off. It keeps ringing until you get to fresh air. So it's persistent and insistent, and it's exactly what people need, so you don't ignore it.
And what have you heard back from other people that you loaned it to? What kind of readings did they experience?
Well, they didn't experience very much at all, so I was kind of disappointed. I guess I'm special because I got to see it go into action. And people are saying, you get You get sometimes 10 parts per million in an airplane, but that's just environmental.
Now, what did Brad think about this as kind of troubleshooting of his problem? Did he think things might have gotten worse if you hadn't found it, or what did the two of you talk about, afterwards?
Well, one thing we realized was that it actually was a pretty good early warning of an engine starting to fail slightly. I mean, losing the exhaust system is not good. It changes the back pressures. It can cause other problems inside your engine as well. Plus, it makes a huge racket and starts shaking things. So we were happy, first of all, that we were okay. But at the same time, we recognized that this is sort of a diagnostic device to tell you that something's starting to fall apart on the airplane. And, maybe if he had this on previous flights, he would have started to see the numbers go up slightly if a crack was starting to develop, and could have caught it even earlier. So it's good for people. It's good for airplanes. That's
got to be one of the only tools I can think of that helps both with the health of the pilot and the health of the airplane.
Indeed. So I'm a convert. I appreciate the fact that you and others told us about this.
And as we start to wrap up here, any suggestions you have for other pilots or anything you're looking to do differently in the future?
Well, the obvious recommendation would be that everybody should get one of these things. There are different ones out there on the market. They're very reasonably priced. I would say that it's the price of 1 hour in a Cessna. The other recommendations I'd have would be that detectors only work if you have them turned on and have them out where they can sample the air. I've talked to some pilots. They say, well, they keep it in the flight bag. Well, that's okay, but it probably won't get a very quick reading if it's down where the air is not passing over it. And I saw one guy online. He was saying that he only turns it on when he thinks there's a problem. Well, if you're impaired by carbon monoxide, how would you know to think to turn it on? I wouldn't try to save the battery life. I would just have it on all the time I'm in the airplane. I think the other thing I'd recommend is know the numbers. 35 is the one of the OSHA limits, and I guess that's why they use that for occupational. So that sounds like a pretty good number for pilots to follow. It doesn't mean you need to stop flying right that minute, but the pilots ought to figure out, what level is tolerable in the short run so that they can land normally, or if they have to declare an emergency. And, I think from my experience, I'd say you don't want to have a number of 100 or higher at any time. That's the point where you should declare the emergency and land. Last recommendation is kind of more an insight. I mean, I heard it on your podcast as well. And that is, don't assume because you haven't had a fatal accident with carbon monoxide. Don't assume that you haven't been exposed to it at moderate levels, which may have affected your ability to continue your flight safely. If you feel like you're having a bad day or just not feeling well, or if you find you're making a bunch of mistakes, you might want to presume that you've had some carbon monoxide exposure. And if you have one of these gadgets, I highly recommend it for pilots and for the safety of their passengers.
Well, Dave, thanks so much for sharing your story today with our listeners.
Well, thank you. And thank you for helping to spread the word. I heard the word from you and others, and I hope we can pass it along to other folks.
And I want to thank both Davids for sharing their stories. Now, this David said that there had been a backfire when starting the aircraft. And as we talked about in a prior episode, backfires can damage the exhaust system in your aircraft to the point where they cause a carbon monoxide leak. So you probably want to have your exhaust system checked out if you ever have a backfire when you're starting an airplane. Now, both Davids had very similar stories that happened literally within 1 or 2 days of each other, and both independently came up with the same phrase, which was that buying a good carbon monoxide detector is equivalent to the cost of paying for about an hour of rental time in an aircraft. So you might want to just ask yourself, is your life and the life of your passengers worth the cost of an hour of aircraft rental? And if it is, why don't you have a carbon monoxide monitor yet? I've made it easier for you to get one if you'd like, as I've put links in the show notes to some of the carbon monoxide detectors mentioned here in the show in case you want to order one. To get to the show notes, just tap or drag on the artwork for this episode in the podcast app that you're listening to for this show, or just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/102, type all that in, and you'll find the show notes there. Coming up next, listener feedback and questions here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Antoine Bossard, who writes in part, "Your podcast has accompanied me all throughout last year as I was finishing my instrument, commercial, and CFI, all while working full-time as an engineer. I'm now working on completing my CFII," and he says episode 101 was spot on for that, "and transitioning away from an engineering career into full-time flight instruction. I have already recommended your podcast to many of my students and fellow flight instructors. Everyone seems to love it." Well, Antoine, congratulations to you on making the transition here to a second career. That's essentially what I did, and boy, I thought I had a good time in the 25 years I was at HP, but I'm having a heck of a lot more fun now, so I hope that works out just as well for you. And anyone else who's looking to make that transition, if you want to get in touch with me for any suggestions or feedback or coaching, I'm happy to help with you. Here is an email from Edward in Ohio. He said, "Just listen to the podcast on the SR-22 Air Force pilot accident. The SOP concept, so standard operating procedures, was drilled into me during transition training in Waukesha, Wisconsin, moving from an air coupe of all things to an RV-12 with a former T-38 instructor and MD-80 captain. In the VFR pattern, my instructor drilled me on the exact concept you discussed. Same place, same airspeed, same power setting, every time. At the numbers, I was to be at idle to bleed off airspeed to best glide speed of 63 knots, 1 notch of flaps, and then turn to base and at the key full flaps, holding 63 to 65 knots till landing assured over the numbers. It just plain works." And Edward, yes, you are absolutely right. I think the beauty of standard operating procedures is that it makes every landing easy if you do it the same way every time. If you don't do it the same way every time, you're then forced to do a little bit of heroics to make it work. Not that you can't, but why would you make landings exciting when you could make them dull and excellent? So just my thoughts on that. Here's an email from Larry Noe, who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says the last episode on the oil on the windshield emergency, the episode was excellent. That was episode 101. He said, "I was so impressed with a student pilot. She was amazing." Yes, she was. I totally agree with you, Larry. He says, "I'm not sure I would have been so cool now with over 1,000 hours, and definitely not when I was a student. Just a great story and great episode." Larry, I agree with you. I commented once on the Airplane Geeks podcast about an emergency, and one of the co-hosts said, "How would you have reacted, Max?" And I said, "Oh, I probably would have lost my cool totally." But I think that goes back to a comment that I made earlier in the show, which is there are probably ways to prepare yourself and to drill yourself just so that you are ready for those kinds of situations. I look forward to feedback people have on how best to do that. Here's an email from another one of our Patreon supporters, Don Dillman in Tennessee. He says, "Max, good show with episode 99. Again, that was the one with the Air Force pilot who crashed in the Cirrus SR20. He says, "A couple of thoughts. You guys alluded to it, but in my opinion, the key difference between a professional pilot and an amateur is often standardization. And I think by professional pilot, Don probably doesn't mean just people who fly for a living. I suspect he means people who fly professionally, which is what all pilots should try to do." He said, "Pilots flying commercially, especially Part 121, fly a standard approach as that's required of their duties, and it's the norm." He said, "The biggest reason is that you can or will fly with a different crew or pilot every trip, and that's why they want to have standardization." He said, "While there are variations in some techniques, the acceptable box that you operate in is well defined. Believe it or not, even pilots with tens of thousands of hours may not be good natural pilots or good sticks, but they are standardized. With that said, you can be just as standard in GA as in the heavies. In fact, as you well know, there's a method to teaching in airplanes like the Bonanza simply called by the numbers. And yes, there was a great book that I've referred to in the past, which was called Flying by the Numbers, which was written by Richard Collins, former editor-in-chief of Flying Magazine." Don continues, "It's been 35 plus years since I've flown a T-38, but as I remember, the standard VFR traffic pattern was always a constant turn from downwind to final. Therefore, if he'd been flying a lot in that aircraft, checking out as an instructor pilot, he was likely resorting to the standard for that environment, including seat-of-the-pants feel, which is much different than the Cirrus. It certainly doesn't explain the high bank and pitch, but does possibly explain the sequence prior to the unstable approach. Certainly not judging my aviation brother, rather just trying to learn. Take care. Thanks for all you do." Thank you, Don. And let's go to listener questions.
Hey, Max, it's Ron. Hey, great show as always. Really enjoyed the 10 tips for that impossible turn segment. Question regarding the new changes to the currency requirements and that you can use a technically advanced aircraft for complex. One thing they didn't mention is does can we retroactively count all of our, say, G1000 time as complex time, or is it only moving forward from the effective date? Because that's going to be interesting how to make that change to log it moving forward. So thanks for that.
Great question, Ron. Sorry I didn't get to it sooner. This came in a number of months ago. Of course, last year, the commercial was changed so that people no longer need to provide a complex aircraft for the check ride. However, that did not change the definition of complex. So what did change was that if you go to your commercial check ride or your CFI check ride, you no longer have to furnish a complex airplane. You could come in on a Cessna 172 if you wanted to. The change did not alter the commercial requirements for applicants to log 10 hours of flight time in a complex aircraft. So to answer your question, nope, you can't go back and change any of the time that you logged in non-complex aircraft and now call it complex time. And here's an email from Steve. He says, I'll be doing my private practical test next week. Congratulations to you, Steve. He says, I'll be continuing on for my instrument rating. I'll be turning 65 in May, and I'm wondering if it's too late to continue on and get my CFI rating. I'm just looking at the economics of this route. Well, Steve, two different questions there, but let me tell you first that CFIs are in very short supply right now, as the airlines have been hiring lots of them to become airline pilots. So yes, I think you'd find demand for your teaching skills if that's what you'd like to do. Now, if you're asking, will you fully recover the cost you'll spend getting your CFI through the revenue you'll make teaching? Well, there is no way to know that for sure. But if you're really concerned about that, I would say check around to see if there's a local flight school that would be interested in hiring you after you get your CFI and talk with them now about how much money you might make teaching for them. But regardless, getting your CFI will make you a better pilot. And if you like learning, well, the process of getting your CFI, I think, really is a reward within itself. I still remember passing my CFI check ride, and it really was one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done in flying. I absolutely love teaching. I find it's great fun helping people become better pilots and to help them meet their goals. You know, to me, when someone solos, I'm almost as excited as they are. So I will also tell you that being a CFI is a great way to get lots of flying in. So if you like flying every day, you'll probably enjoy being a CFI. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Adam Nunn. He says, episode 99 was a tough episode to listen to. That's the one where we were talking about the Air Force pilot who crashed on landing with a Cirrus. Adam says, I appreciate the value that was discussed regarding the stabilized approach. I try to have a stabilized approach with power off during most of my landings in Cherokees and Champs, etc. I understand that the Cirrus and larger aircraft have different approach procedures, but how does one prepare themselves for an emergency engine-out landing in these aircraft if pulling the chute is not an option? I'm just curious how one stays proficient in engine-out procedures and addresses pitch attitudes, airspeed management, wind direction, power, and configuration when one is mostly proficient in power-on approaches. Well, Adam, I was taught to make every landing as a power-off approach when I was learning to fly, but that was at a very quiet airport in northern Pennsylvania where there was literally never anybody else in the pattern at the same time I was there. But at the Towered Airport where I teach, we're rarely able to do a power-off approach as we're often number 3 or number 4 to land and have to follow an aircraft in a pattern that's so large that it puts us beyond gliding distance to the runway. So, yes, unfortunately, there are times that when the engine quits, there is just going to be no way to reach the runway. And once we're below, say, 500 or 600 feet, depending upon the model of Cirrus that I'm in, we are too low to pull the parachute. So in that case, we would have to land in the marshlands below us. Now, on takeoff from my airport, I always know exactly where I'm going to land if the engine quits, and that landing spot varies depending upon the altitude I'm at. And I try to focus actively on thinking throughout the climb out about which spot I'm now currently in a position to touch down at. So, for example, initially I may be able to turn left and land on a golf course. Later, until maybe above around 200 feet AGL, I can turn slightly right and land on a very narrow levee. After that, to avoid going into the high-tension towers and power lines there, I'll need to land straight ahead, and then perhaps above 300 or 400 feet, I'll be in a position to turn a little bit to the right, glide over the power lines, and land on another narrow levee next to the edge of the bay. And then above 500 or 600 feet, I'm back up in the range where I'll be able to pull the parachute. But the reality is that there just are some places where if the engine quits, we're going to have few good choices for where to land. But if you're always actively thinking about where you'll land if the engine quits, especially when you're close to the ground, you'll be better prepared if and when the engine does quit. And as for staying proficient in power-off approaches, well, there's really only one way to do that, and that's to practice them. So we do that on rare occasions when we can fit them in at my home airport, but we do fit them in a lot when we go to non-towered airports. And it's kind of funny. I've had a couple people just in the last couple of weeks I've run into in person who said, yeah, and I've been meaning to go out to the Patreon site and sign up. So if you've been meaning to go out to the Patreon site and sign up, go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And you can check the posts that I put up there, as well as you can use a credit card to send us a few dollars a month. And we thank you for your support. Of course, we thank everybody for all the support they provide for the show by sending listener questions. And by the way, the way to do that, just go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on a listener question at the top of the page, and you can either record a question or send an email. Also appreciate the reviews that you leave for us on the different apps like iTunes, and all the feedback that you send as well. And if you are at all interested in buying any model of Cirrus aircraft or jet, or interested in flight training in one, please contact me today for free consultations. Just call me at 650-967-2500. Free call. We'll just talk for a while and see if I can help meet your needs. Or just go to our website, aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top, and you can send me an email. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And by the way, if you have a meeting coming up, whether it's an EAA chapter meeting or any type of aviation gathering, and you'd like to play a portion of one of these podcasts for your group, feel free to go ahead and do that. And also tell your friends about how they can find the Aviation News Talk podcast. And a lot of folks don't know what podcasts are, so the easiest way to get them to listen is just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and then search for Aviation News Talk, just like they would search for any other app, and they'll find our dedicated Aviation News Talk app. And of course, that app is free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.